Hey, everybody. Welcome to Read It Again's online author event series. Today we have Soniah Kamal. Hi.
Hi, Kim. Thank you so much for having me in
Unmarriageable. Well, thank you for coming. Not that you're just in your library. I love that wall behind you. That is a great wall.
Thank you. Thank you. It's part of my study, which my husband likes to call his study. It's our study. So my study, mine. So
Yours.
yeah. It's a collection of South Asian books and Jane Austen books and a few photographs. So yeah, I try.
Looks good. I've got your book behind me.
Yeah.
Yeah, there we go.
And the paperback.
I actually really love this hardback. Like, I'm going to be sad if anybody buys it. By the way, I have autographed copies of Sonia's books in stock. I have this one autographed. If you guys want the paperbacks, we can figure that out because Sonia doesn't. You live right around the corner.
I'm not very far away at all. I would be happy to come in and sign anyone's book for them. Yeah.
Sonia, do you mind giving like a brief summary of your book, Unmarriageable?
So Unmarriageable is what I call a parallel retelling of Jane Austen's classic Pride and Prejudice. And by that, I mean that it follows the plot and it has every character that appears in Pride and Prejudice. And the reason for that, the reason it is not a sequel or an inspired by, but very much as the subtitle says, Pride and Prejudice in Pakistan, is because it is very much a post-colonial retelling because of the whole history of empire, British colonialism coming in, reconfiguring language and education in all of its throughout empire, where English became the language of the lingua franca of privilege, advantage, education for the most part. So I wanted to sort of take back identity, rewrite identity, reorient identity. And so therefore, this is very much a parallel retelling of Austen's Pride and Prejudice, but this one is set in Pakistan, and it definitely has its own originality and different characters, and all the my Bennet sisters have their own personalities, etc. Charlotte Lucas has a bigger part, etc. But it does follow the plot of Pride and Prejudice.
So if this wasn't a retelling and it was a like an inspired by, what would you have done differently?
Oh, for one, Alys would have, my Alice Binat, she would have never gotten married. She goes throughout the book saying she doesn't want to get married, really. She would not have, but I had to stick to what Austen gave me, which was really much harder than I thought it would be, because you want to take your characters in different, on different journeys, different ways. But it was almost like I always struggle with coloring within borders, when you're doing coloring stuff. And here I had to stay within certain restrictions because that was the storyline Austen gave me. So yeah, Alys wouldn't have gotten married. Jena would have been divorced with a child. I don't know if Charlotte would have gotten married, honestly. Lots of different things. Like my mother likes to say, you don't want anyone to get married, which is not true. I got married myself. So
well, speaking of Charlotte, you flesh her out a good bit in this book, which yes. I like. Yeah, you
Charlotte do. Charlotte is my favorite character in all of Austen's novels. And I remember when I first read Pride and Prejudice at age 16, and in fact, I kept my red copy up. This is my original copy, which my aunt gave me. It's red leather with gold. How do I position this? Gold lettering, and it has what I refer to as, what the book refers to as color plates. But illustrations, and can you see them? I don't know.
Yeah.
So anyway, so this is my original from God knows when. So when I read this the first time at age 16, I was really struck by Charlotte, because as much as Elizabeth and Alys are the modern heroines who go out there and they talk back to Catherine de Bourgh, etc. They walk across muddy fields. They want to marry for love and respect. Well, I think even more than love, honestly, respect. Because Darcy says he does love her, but Elizabeth and Alys want respect. But for me, Charlotte was such an eye-opener, because she literally, for being the drab girl that she is, for being the woman who apparently now has no future, because in Regency England also, when Jane Austen set Pride and Prejudice, women of that class, really the gentry class, could not marry. Their sole way of earning an income and a living, if you will, was through getting married. And so being a Westminster at that time was a pretty hard place to be. I mean, you could be a governess, but that was about it for that particular class. And then you were dependent on male relatives. So remaining unmarried was quite a hardship at that time, unless you had a generous male relative who would take care of you. And in the world of Pride and Prejudice, Charlotte Lucas was already up there. You know, she was not young. She wasn't pretty. She didn't necessarily have a huge dowry per se, or money coming with her. So when she sees Mr. Collins and she decides he's a good match, like what I like to call catch and match for her, match and catch. So she does that. She matches herself with him, and then she goes out to catch him. And in the original Pride and Prejudice, Austen literally tells us that Charlotte Lucas accidentally meets Mr. Collins in the street. And in the next sentence, they're getting married. And I always wondered what happened between those two lines, always. But also for me, like I said, modern heroine, because she realizes even though Mr. Collins has been jilted by her best friend, and really, how many of us at that age or otherwise would want to date our best friend's leftovers or someone they've jilted per se, especially if they're Mr. Collins. But she realizes in the milieu and the society she's living, he is a good match and catch. And when she does maneuver his proposal, and that was another thing I always wondered, that did he give her the same proposal he literally gave Elizabeth Bennet a few days ago? So I was very curious about that also in my imagination. But when then Elizabeth finds out that she's marrying Mr. Collins and she has words with Charlotte comes back and she doesn't let peer pressure get to her. And I remember at 16, 17, 18, your friends and their opinions of what they think about the guys or your life or this, that, your clothes and stuff is so important. And I was really struck by the fact that Charlotte had this strong backbone where she didn't let peer pressure. She knew what was the right course for her at that point in time. Now, the thing is, I think people often, we often think that the decisions we make are the ones that are supposed to sustain and be the best ones for us throughout our lifetime. But the fact is, when we know better, we do better, like I think Maya Angelou said. But the fact is, when we take and make decisions in our life, we take them at that particular moment in time, which is what Charlotte did. Now, whether she's happy or not happy, whether she enjoys her time and, with Mr. Collins for the rest of her life, who knows? I think I've given her a lot of backstory and future story in Unmarriageable. So I've spun a different Charlotte Lucas here in many respects, bulked her up. But, at that moment in time, Charlotte did what was best for her. And I really, really respected that. Elizabeth's muddy skirts were great, but Charlotte really, she's very, very modern for taking her life and her decisions. And I'm sure women did all the time, over there, but Austen gave us one of those women's.
I love the interaction between Alys and, what's Charlotte's name in your book?
Sherry, but they call her Sherry. Yes.
I love their interaction. They had a good. You wrote that very well, because I felt like I'm like, on one hand I was like, Charlotte, why are you marrying him? Of course, I'm a big Austen fan, so I knew why. But and I got where Alys was really upset, but I kept thinking, Alys, you need to just let her do it. But at the same time, Alys is like, well, what if he turns into this horrible husband because they've only known each other for 5 seconds? And what if, like, he will have all the control and she will have none? So I imagine like watching a friend go through a marriage that was not quite arranged, but almost, where you're stressed. You don't know what's going to happen to your best friend. And I think you wrote that very well. Like, I was stressed, even though I know it's Mr. Collins, he's harmless. So
at least what Austen tells us, I think he is, or at least the way I've written him also. Like, I've really given him a lot of backstory and stuff also in Unmarriageable. And the honest truth is, Kim, I think whether it's in Austen's time, obviously once you got married, it was very hard to get divorced or to leave your husband. But I think in contemporary times, and Unmarriageable is set in the 2000s in contemporary Pakistan, really divorce is a possibility. And if you have a good, like I stress in Unmarriageable, half of the messages, for women who come from traditional cultures that, you know, have a career and have a good career that pays well if possible. You know, if you're not coming with a large inheritance of your own, you want to be in a financially secure position, which is what Alys keeps telling her ninth graders. The ninth graders she teaches, not that they listen to her, but at least she tries to impart that. And you know, because whether it's through an arranged marriage, which I want to emphasize is not forced marriage. Forced marriage is a very different thing. You know, arranged marriage is you know, your parents or your friends or you ever think it's like a blind date almost. They think that this person will be a good match for you, and then you meet that person, and on both sides you decide if you want to be with that person or not, and go on from there. What happens, I think, between the cultures is that I think, you know, for certain cultures, when you say blind date, it's just one-on-one. The individuals need to get along. But in more like unmarriageable territory and, you know, traditional societies in Pakistan and stuff, you're sort of looking for a match between the families also, because the families have so much more interaction than in some other cultural places. So, you know, whether so be it arranged love, be it, you know, your love marriage scenario, etc., things can go wrong very fast, as we know. You know, it's not like you get a love marriage, you fall in love with someone and then you're with them for the rest of your life and leaping up and down with, you know, bouquets and singing songs. So either way, you never know. It's a gamble in a way, you know. It's a gamble in either way, because I personally think that until you end up living with someone or getting married, either way, unless you're with someone day in and day out, you really don't know what you've got. You know, it's like I always equate it almost to a doctor situation in some respects. Is like you don't know how your doctor is going to be. You know, your well visits are all very well, but until things start going wrong. And by that, I sometimes mean children come into the equation or elderly parents come into the equation. You know, when things get a little harder is when you really know the partner and the person you've married or you're committed to. And that can change in the long run for anyone at any time. And thankfully, be it love marriage or arranged marriage, the option of leaving in our contemporary societies, thankfully, is always there.
So speaking of things going wrong, so Pride and Prejudice, of course, is about somebody being prideful and being prejudiced. But I read somewhere that you also feel that it's a bit about disgrace.
No, I don't. I'm not sure if I think it's about disgrace. Yeah. I mean, I think there are a lot of in Austen's book, the woman set up to be disgraced the most in many respects is Lydia Bennet, who is Lady in my novel. And the reason she's named Lady is not a Pakistani name, but Austen first published. She never published under her name. Her first book was published by a lady, and then subsequently was, you know, so that's a nod to her. Little Easter eggs for Austen readers, although Unmarriageable is a completely standalone novel, so you don't have to have read Pride and Prejudice or know anything about Jane Austen to read it. It's completely standalone. But I mean, there are moments there's disgrace, I think, actually, in some respect in most literature. And we might think of it in different names. We might call it disgrace and grace. We might call it dishonor and honor. We might call it being insulted or insulting someone. I mean, those moments of that sort of thing is always there. But I think, once again, in a traditional culture, because your disgrace is always seen in a sort of bigger light, where it also reflects on your family, which is always the interesting dichotomy in all classic literature, and even I think good literature, good stories even now, which is how do you balance the individual aspect of your life or your character's life with the communal aspect of it. You know, as much as in the US there is a strong, you know, American individualism and stuff is wonderful. It comes with its own pluses and bonuses. On the other hand, there is something for communal bonds. I mean, I know whole neighborhoods where neighbors don't know each other. You know, they're living side by side and they don't know each other, which is in contrast sometimes to more traditional societies where you know your neighbors so well that you're like, okay, too much information here. So that odd balance between how do we get to live our lives as individuals and yet be part of a community and close-knit communities. It's very important. And I think especially the days we're living in right now, all the more so important, because via the internet, the way technology is going, as much as there seems to be this emphasis on nationalism in so many countries, so many places, the fact remains that we are global citizens. But the butterfly effect is everything, as we've seen. What touches someone in one place touches someone in another place inevitably at some point in time. And I think for me, books always were that butterfly effect, because I read books that did not reflect my culture, even though in Pakistan I've grown up in English and in English medium, and I've grown up in British literature. Empire came to the subcontinent in 1947. India and Pakistan became two separate sovereign nations, but that history of British legacy, which I bring up in Unmarriageable also, and actually in the paperback edition, there's an essay about how my fictitious town, the Lipabad, gets its name, and that takes us actually through a journey of 16th century to colonialism, to sovereign country, and that's how the town gets its name. But for me, I'd always therefore seen the butterfly effects, the universalities between in other literature, because when I'd read stuff as a kid, my favorite books, or just any books, I quickly flipped into thinking of characters as being Pakistani. So for a quick example, if they were eating scones, or if they were eating, I don't know, ham sandwiches, I would immediately think, samosas and palau, or, my favorite dishes and stuff. So I very quickly started to do that. So cultural flip, seeing myself in other books from other cultures, set in other cultures, other countries, was very second nature to me from a very young age. Whether Anne of Green Gable, whether Margaret and Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret, whether Sweet Valley High, Jessica Elizabeth, they were there. But I think with Unmarriageable, what I also wanted to do and convey was to give this opportunity of seeing yourself in a culture you might not be familiar with, to readers who might not necessarily have pick up books from different cultures per se, but via Unmarriageable be able to suddenly see themselves in a different culture and realize, hey, we're not so different after all.
I did an event with you, I guess that was last year, and you talked about, it's like, oh, what is this month? And you talked about how when you first read Pride and Prejudice, and you thought, oh, this could totally take place in Pakistan.
Oh yeah, I call it in another essay at the end of the paperback and hardback, I call it a quintessentially Pakistani novel. I mean, it was. I in fact, I have so many people from different cultures who read Unmarriageable and tell me that this Pakistan is just like their culture, American South and Jewish culture, and all over the world, honestly. And the fact is that I think that the themes that Austen wrote about, or the story that she tells, it's about a mother frantic to get her 5 unmarried daughters married, and married well. And let's shift the equation. If we don't want to think of it in terms of marriage, she's then a mother who wants to see her daughters be with someone, whether it's be with loving, respectful partners, whether those partners are male, whether those partners are female, whether those relationships take whichever equation you want to live your life in, whichever relationships you choose to live them in. She's just a person who wants to see her daughters really happy and settled at the end of the day. Now, let me also say that for her, happiness for my Mrs. Bennet and Austen's Mrs. Bennet, happiness does equate to being well settled, meaning married well, rich, and but that also equates to financial security. For Austen, very much being part of a place where women were dependent. It's a big deal that Elizabeth Bennet says no to Mr. Collins, and then she says no to Mr. Darcy. In no way, shape, or form in that society where she's one sister of Elizabeth Bennet is one of 5 sisters. They have no brother. Their house is going to disappear once their father dies. In that particular milieu, there's no way in hell she should have said no to Mr. Collins to begin with, let alone Mr. Darcy. But she does, And yeah, it's a quintessential Pakistani novel because, as I said, the whole dichotomy between, which Elizabeth goes through also, between being an individual who has the right to say no and marry for the reasons, or spend her life with a partner for the reasons she wants to, versus being part of a culture or a community where you marry for other reasons also, you do marry for the secure financial security. You might marry, one of the reasons you might marry is because you see that, oh, my parents get along with his parents, so this is a good match in those terms too. So there's so much interplay over there. So yeah.
How have Austen fans reacted to your book?
I think they've loved it so far. Everyone I've heard, Georgia, the Jane Austen Society of North America, so many chapters have taken it to heart. I mean, I remember the first one that read it was the Georgia chapter, and they did a book club and an interview with me. And honestly, I was so scared. This is when the hardback came out last year, and I was scared. I took a deep breath before going into the room, and I kid you not, it's on video. They all stood up and clapped, and I was like, and because Jasna readers, these are readers who know their Austen inside out. They know Jane Austen, and it's very difficult sometimes to please a lot of them, the purists or otherwise, with your takes on them. So for that to happen, and then Jasna California chapter invited me to give the Jane Austen birthday tea this past December, and that was lovely. And that's online too. And then I've been invited for the Jane Austen Festival in Louisville, Kentucky, to be their keynote speaker, and I've been invited by another Jane Austen big festival of Jane Austen Society of North America to be one of their panelists as a novelist. So it's just been a delightful ride, and I'm really happy that they've loved it, because I was scared to do it. I mean, like I said, it's not a prequel. It's not an inspired by. This is very much Jane Austen. This is Pride and Prejudice set in Pakistan. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you, there were two things I wasn't expecting at all. Number one, people who, the number of Jane Austen fans or readers who come to it through that. Like I said, it's a complete standalone. So you don't have to read, Pride and Prejudice.
I agree. I've read it. You don't have to read them. You can just dive right in.
Yeah. So, but the number of and this is where I realized why they're, I think, loving it so much, is because you read a book or you watch a movie for the first time, and that's it. That's your first time. But because this is Pride and Prejudice set in Pakistan, the same plot, characters with added features and stuff, they feel as if they're reading Pride and Prejudice for the first time again. Mm-hmm. And it's just bringing their childhood back, their memories back, their associations, nostalgia, everything. And there's no higher, there are few higher compliments than that, honestly, Kim. But another one that took me by surprise was people who are reading this as a standalone and then reading Austen for the first time, or tried reading Austen before but couldn't really get into it, and then read Unmarriageable, and had it been one or two people, I wouldn't put so much credence on it, but it is like, it's amazing how many people have come up and told me both these things, and every time I hear something, it's a joy. I mean, you write a book, you put it out there, you hope it'll resonate with some readers and stuff, and the way this has, it's been, I used to start crying. I'm a little better this year. No tears for you, Kim. No.
It's okay.
I'm crying inside with joy.
Right. So I love the story of how you wrote the book, because you wrote it in what, like 2 months?
Yeah, I wrote it in 2 months. It was actually supposed to be my it was not supposed to. It was my master's thesis at Georgia State University, where I did a 4-year full-time MFA in creative writing with a literature component. So I was doing academic papers and this, and I should have had 2 years or so to do an entire thesis, but unfortunately we discovered a glitch in the syllabus at the very end, and I only had 2 months to deliver a novel. And mind you, this is Unmarriageable is my second published novel. My first novel is my debut novel actually is an isolated incident, and it's coming out in England, in UK in this July, and I'm so excited. It's very different from Unmarriageable. It's set against the Kashmir conflict. It's set over many countries, not just Pakistan. It's in Afghanistan, the US, in the DC area. It's against the Kashmir conflict. It's about healing and what you do in times of conflict if you lose all your family, and how you heal or don't heal. It's a very different sort of book, but it's coming out, so I'm very, very excited about that.
I read that you wrote that because of your father.
No, my grandfather. So my grandfather was a refugee from Indian administered, some people say occupied, Kashmir into, he fled over the mountains into This is around 1947, 1948, when the partition between India and Pakistan took place, and Kashmir became a hot point between whose land was that. And then he went into Pakistan, occupied, and some people say administered. And I say this because I've been told by many Kashmiris to make this a point to say both of these, especially both of these words. And much, and I saw that there's actually an essay at the end of an isolated incident, which talks about my growing up, seeing my elder two aunts, my mother's elder sisters, who were married in India and remained there, and my grandparents and my sisters and stuff in Pakistan, and how difficult it was for them to get visas. Actually, when my grandfather died, my aunts were not able to get a visa to come see him. Actually, anyway, what should have really been a 2-3 hour journey ended up being a 2-day journey, and they were too late to see him. But around that time, he knew he had actually told. I'd always been scribbling as a kid, and I think he thought I was going to be a journalist. And he made me promise that I would write about Kashmir. I'm a novelist predominantly. I mean, I have a lot of personal essays out there, as I say, behind Unmarriageable.
And Soniah writes a great essay. I highly recommend tracking some down. She wrote this beautiful one about her childhood reading experience that I made me cry.
Thank you. Where was this?
Oh, the one talking about all the books you read and all the women whose shoulders you stood on, and to become you. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I think it's on the Toast. It was, I think Roxane Gay was the editor for that. So it's on the Toast, which is now defunct, but it's still online. And then it was also published in Scroll India. And then I have another one called The Reluctant Writer in Catapult online also, and that also talks about how I came to terms with becoming a writer, but I didn't want to. But your question was my grandfather, and yes, I promised him that I would write about Kashmir, and that's how An Isolated Incident came up. It took me 10 years to write about. It was very hard for me to write a novel set in an ongoing political conflict, which is still ongoing in many respects, between India and Pakistan. And novelists, or at least I, do not write propaganda. So, you have to give an equal, fair tale to everyone. And that's what I tried to do. And reviews said I was successful, so that was good. But Unmarriageable, in contrast to An Isolated Incident's 10 years, Unmarriageable, I had 2 months. I had to deliver. I'd already been going full time to school for 4 years. I had 3 small children. My youngest, when I started, was 4. He was now 8. I think he would have fainted, as I would have fainted, if I had to stay in grad school any longer. It was very, very tough, Kim. I smile about it. But going back to grad school was such a long 4-year program at that time. Now I believe the master's program at Georgia State is now 2 years long. But at that time, I was the last person to do it with 4 years. But I learned a lot. I loved it. My professors, the academic, I took classes with, so many wonderful people, including Professor Jay Rajiva, and, and then my creative writing professors, Professor Josh Russell and Sherry Joseph and John Holman. I learned 4 years was wonderful. You learned so much at that stretch. But, like I said, there was a glitch in the syllabus. I had 2 months. But I had my background of having written for 20 years, a debut novel, and also all the essays I'd written. So I was just able to, because I don't want to give anyone the false impression that I just started writing and I was, and that's why I think I brought all my experience to it, and I was able to just do it. Because it's very hard to write a novel. It's very hard. And I really never expected that, I sent it literally an hour before deadline. I submitted it. I submitted actually double what Unmarriageable is. I submitted like 600 pages, and all 3 professors, their emails came back and they said, it's great, send it to your agent. And I was like, okay, great. And then he sold it, very, very quickly too. And this was not meant to happen. So the first year I was very, very stunned as to what just happened. I'm better now. I've taken it in stride now that this happened, because like I said, Isolated took 10 years to write, and it's now coming out in the UK, and it's been a long publishing journey. I mean, I've had a lot of publishing struggles, lot ups and downs, more downs actually than up, but I'm seeing this really nice different side of publishing, with Unmarriageable doing well, and and being loved with readers, and I hope Isolated finds new readers also, and that it comes out here eventually too.
I follow you on social media, and I love your passion. Like, you are such a passionate person, and you can see that when you're talking about your books and the topics that you love and your family's history.
I can talk about everyone's books with passion. Books grew me up. Books are my
Mhm.
parents. Libraries are my home. Bookstores are, I
Mhm.
can't tell you, I walk in and it's like,
Ah,
it's
so
really like,
one of the questions I
this is
wanted to
my
ask you,
family. These are my people. This is my home. So yeah, I do.
you guys,
I
well,
like movies too, by the way. I get very passionate about movies also. Movies and streaming and stuff. I do. These two things for sure.
so one of the things I want to ask you is I feel like reading Unmarriageable, it's like has a laundry list of books that
Yeah.
you read. And that, so do you have a complete list of all the books you
Yes,
list in there?
I do. I do. Actually, it's in the paperback version. We included the entire. So what we have here, there's a lot of extra stuff in the paperback version at the back. And one of the things we included was what I call notes and resources. And so we have all the what I call mentioned in Unmarriageable. We have people, real people who are Pakistani icons. So we have, for instance, Kandil Baloch, who was a rags to riches social media celebrity, Abdur Rahman Chuktai, who's a painter, Alys Fez, after who Alys is not necessarily named, but her nickname comes from Alys. She was a British Pakistani woman who married very, very famous journalist and activist and poet Faiz Ahmed Faiz, who's also in the novel. We have Nazia Hassan Zoeb Hassan, Iqbal Hussain, who's a very famous painter, and one of his paintings shows up prominently in the novel. We have Noor Jahan, who's a singer, and Mullah Nasiruddin, who's an author of folk tales. But then we also have films that come up in the novel, songs that come up, and all the books like you mentioned. So they are. I haven't actually. I should have counted. So we have. I can't. There's this page of book. There's this page of book, and this. They're like 3 pages full of books that show up in the novel. So a lot of them are Leila Ahmed, Border Passage, Louisa May Alcott, Alice in Wonderland, Gloria and Zeldua, Arabian Nights, Austen's books, James Baldwin, Judy Blume, Kate Chopin, Agatha Christie, Sandra Cisneros, a whole host of books come up in this, and the list can be found in this one. But the reason for that very much was because I grew up like that. I spent my middle school and some of my high school years in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. And I went to an international school there, and the library was full of American books and books from British authors or short stories from everywhere, and Anne of Green Gables, and who else? Everywhere. And then on TV there was British. There was so much. And what wasn't in the school library? My friends from different countries, Nigeria, Japan, India. Everyone was bringing in their different summer reading stuff, and then on TV, because this is an Arab Muslim country. On TV back in that time, late 80s and stuff, they would have reenactments of stories from the Quran. So and so there was that. So I have all these different streams of things that went into my upbringing, and I enjoyed it then, but I treasure it now. It was just wonderful. It was just wonderful for me. Books really parented me, but to have so many different parents from so many different cultures and so many different points of view, I loved it. And I wanted to share that upbringing and the wonderful doors it opens and the journeys it provides to readers also who might not be at all familiar with books from different cultures and stuff, or who might be a little bit familiar but not see them resonating and seeing them as universal. So what I have in the book is called Analogous Literatures, and I don't know where that passage is, but it literally talks about books which come from the Eastern canon, or at least Pakistani literature, and are equivalent thematically to so there's Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan. I forget who I've made that equivalent with, but
sorry, I'm not sure about that.
Okay. But yeah, I'm not sure about that either. But there's a lot of women. A Brewster Place comes up, and I match that with Mahalakshmi Kapul by Rajinder Singh Bedi, an Indian and Pakistan pre-1947 writer. So yeah, there's a lot of books and literature and talk about books, and it's what Alys and Darsee, My Elizabeth and Valentine come together over too. They bond over books. They find love over books. And you know, like one of my quote in Unmarriageable says, people come in, it's a truth universally acknowledged, that people come into our lives to recommend books. I mean, hey, people come and go, and sometimes you don't like them, but if nothing else, hopefully they recommended something of value to your life.
Well, it reminded me, talking about how you grew up, you know what they say, it takes a village, but for you, I think it takes a library.
It takes a library, but you know, a library is a village, but it's also a town, it's a country, it's a culture, it's the world, it's the universe, it's a galaxy. In bookstores are too. I mean, there are books from everywhere. If you're lucky and you have a library and a bookstore which has books from everywhere, you know, really, you've got the world at your fingertips in so many ways. You know, it's just wonderful.
So in your book also, it made me very hungry.
You and everyone else.
You describe the food so well, and then the colors and the richness, it's just very vibrant. And but it's funny because I know you love to cook, but Alys is not a big fan of cooking.
You know, I did not cook until I came to the US. And so I found that I liked to cook once I came here, and I taught myself to cook. So the first time I came out to college in the early 90s in the US, and the first time I made spaghetti, I put it in cold water and left it to boil, and you can imagine what it came out like. And I was like, what just happened? And it took me so from going from not being able to boil spaghetti to realizing that I really like cooking. Cooking is a hobby of mine. I know often people, especially in the US, they seem to be under the guise that everything should be monetized. And I will say, I mean, I'm apparently a decent enough cook for people to say, can you cater for us? You should open a restaurant, whatnot. And no, it's my hobby. You know, I don't want to turn it into something where I'm no longer relaxed. Yes, and I am one of those people. Please be annoyed with me, but I find chopping onions and vegetables and everything very, very relaxing. And I have several dietary restrictions, so often I cook and go by smell. I'm someone who cooks based on the smell of things, because sometimes I can't taste stuff, just because, you know, I have carb restrictions and stuff. But you know, so when my brother came out to college in the US, I remember I was married and, you know, and cooking by that time, and he'd call me up and he'd say, what's the recipe for this? And I'd say, I don't know, I just throw things into the fridge, you know, from the fridge. And he'd be like, well, how much salt? And I'm like, are you kidding? What do you mean, how much salt? Like,
Taste it.
Just figure it out. Yeah. So I'm very much, you know, because people are like, oh, can you do a cookbook and a sherry cookbook? I'm like, no, because I don't know the recipes to any of these things. But, you know, I do. I love to cook, which really serves my family and guests really well, because there's always something, you know, something in my fridge or something on the stove. I hate to clean. Okay. I'm not into cleaning. So, but I love cooking. And I think, and I was very, very, you know, my debut novel, An Isolated Incident, it's very different, and it doesn't have a lot of food in it. But Unmarriageable, the food in Unmarriageable is not just to showcase food. It really is. It's Unmarriageable, like Pride and Prejudice, is set in the domestic sphere of women. And often in traditional cultures, unfortunately, it seems to be that cooking happens to be a space where women showcase themselves often, you know. And in Unmarriageable, in Pride and Prejudice itself, and in Unmarriageable, one of my favorite scenes is when Mrs. Binat, when Alys's mom and Sherry's mom, Mrs. Lucas, are fighting about whether which type of woman is going to be divorced quicker. A woman who has grown up, who comes from a socioeconomic strata where she's grown up cooking in the kitchen like Sherry has, or a woman like Alys who belongs to a socioeconomic strata where she's never cooked, and, you know, she has cooks in her house who cook. And the two women are at it, and they're trying to impress Mr. Collins, my Mr. Colleen. So food very much has a reason for being in this novel, you know. It's a character in itself, and I think I didn't realize that really until so many people started bringing it up as you did, and I was like, oh wow, because my first novel, if you read it for food, it's not going to be there. So
Well, it was actually that led into something that I was going to ask you, kind of answered how you used food and cooking between Charlotte and Alice, and to show an economic social divide.
yeah,
Because
yeah, and in Pakistan, oftentimes it's the food, it's the language you speak in, it's the accent with which you speak that language in, which often does delineate your socioeconomic strata. Like I always like to say is that in Pakistan, the class you come from, and then within that, the family you come from, really determines so often the choices that you're going to have in life. And the lovely example I always like to give is that I wanted to be an actress, never wanted to be a writer. My father forbade me because it wasn't respectable. And yet he sent me off to college in the early 90s to the US by myself. So was he conservative or was he progressive? I do not know. A bit of both, but those, for better or worse, it did end up determining some of the choices I ended up making from there. So yeah.
Speaking of acting, and talking to you is comfortable because I listened to your audiobook. So I had 10 hours of you reading this.
Yes,
I haven't seen the stuff at the end of the book because it's not in the audio. And you do a great job.
Thank you. Yes, it was very sweet, but also a little bit bitter by the end of it. So number one, it wasn't meant to happen. When Unmarriageable sold to Penguin Random House, my agent asked me if I was interested in doing the audio, and I was like, absolutely not. I'm not an actress. People are trained vocally to do that, and I am not. So I said no. And then a year later, I suddenly got an email from the executive editor of Audible of Penguin Random House, and she said, I heard your TEDx talk. I have a TEDx talk about regrets and second chances and stuff. And she said, I've heard your TEDx talk, and I think you can do this. And I was like, I don't want to do this. I want an actor to, an actor to do this. And she said something which really, really touched me because I hadn't even thought of it. She said, think about this. And because my TEDx talk is about how I didn't become an actress and how I struggled to accept myself as a writer. So she said, think about the dream you didn't get to live, which is acting, and the reality you're living, which is writing. And doing the audio of Unmarriageable will fuse the two, because really audio relies on a lot of acting skills. And after she said that, I was so touched, and I was like, okay, what worst comes to worst, they'll kick me out of the studio. They'll say, this was the worst idea in the universe, you don't know what you're doing, out. And the other thing is that, a lot of people don't realize that when you record these audiobooks, it's not like you do chapter 5 and you decide, I want to redo chapter 5. You don't do that. It's pretty much one take. You might re-edit a sentence here and there, but it's one take for the whole thing. And then one of our Georgia authors, wonderful author Jocelyn Jackson, she's actually she comes from a theater background, and she's a trained vocalist. And, I literally had a week before they'd asked me to do it, and I accepted doing it. And I didn't have time to do anything, but she, I contacted her and I said, Jocelyn, help. And she very, very kindly gave me she should change your body language with characters and this, that. But I was very nervous going into studio in Atlanta. And I did, and I went and I loved it. Oh my God, I loved it. And as soon as it was over, I called my parents and I was like, you know what? I was able to do this because, with acting, when you're doing screen acting or theater and stuff, you still have your facial expressions, your body and stuff. With vocal, it's just your voice, your modality, the characters, whatever. And I had I had no background. But I called my parents up and I was like, you know what? Thank you very much. If I was able to pull this off, I might have been able to pull something else off too. And they, as usual, they're very sweet about it. They're like, sorry, it was a different time back then. It's a different time back now, which really has been one of the themes I really like to explore in my essays and work also, is that the time period we find ourselves in life is what we have to deal with. Today's Pakistan is a lot more open when it comes to arts and cultures and respectability issues than mine was 20 years ago. And so people growing up now are growing up in a different Pakistan. People growing up now in America are growing up in a different America. I'm so many people come up to me when I talk about when I give talks and stuff, and they're like, my mother wanted to be an air stewardess. My mother wanted to be in theater, but she couldn't because she had to get married. And these are women who've grown up in the US, or even very recently last year, a librarian shared with me that it was a struggle for her to be allowed to be a librarian because the parents didn't think it would earn enough. And so, there's so many people, and it really touches me when people come and share that with me, because not being allowed to be an actress was a really big deal for me. And I think it was a big deal moreover, not because, oh, I didn't get to be an actress, but because your autonomy is taken away, which brings me back to the whole, do you do what is good for your community because your dad decides it's not respectable, or do you venture forth and do what you want because you want to do that? I'm going to err on the fact, I'm going to go with do what you want to do, live your life, because regret is horrible. Regret is acid at the end of the day. I did a bit of modeling back in Pakistan. I hated it. They put me in that chair for 3 hours makeup. I did some runway modeling. Don't ask how that happened, but I did. And 3 hours they put me in that makeup chair. I hated it. I was like, no, not for me. And I have a small feeling maybe acting would have been the same way, but when you're not allowed to even try something which you think is your dream, it really, that regret, that what if just eats into you all the time. But right, like I say, writing chose me. I'd been scribbling. I've been a storyteller from a very young age, but it's not something I wanted to do. Struggled with it a lot. I call myself the reluctant writer. Now I'm the unreluctant writer. I've accepted that writing chose me. I guess I was meant to be a writer. But writing is a very hard field. It comes with so many publishing ups and downs and everything. So it's a very hard field to really be part of. And then when it's not something that was your dream, then you're like, why am I even doing this? So
I read something that you wrote about how women writers are respectable because they're invisible.
Yeah, I say that in my TEDx talk, actually, and I say that in a few essays also. Reason being that, like I say, you can put your, traditionally used to be, you did not have author photographs on books. And of course, the internet wasn't around, right? So you didn't know what authors looked like. I mean, so here I have a book. Here I have, Silas Marner by George Eliot. You don't know what George Eliot looks like. There's no picture. There's no nothing. I have Sweet Valley High here, Francine Pascal, no picture, nothing. I have my favorite, Dragonlance book, again, co-authors, no picture, not even at the end of the book. So literally for the longest time, what we have now is a blip where you know what the author looks like, you know what they physically look like. There's a face to put to those words. But for the longest time in history, there wasn't. So you could literally bare your soul out, be it poetry, memoir, fiction, whatever. You could write whatever, but no one, you could have, pseudonym, and no one would know who you were. So you could write what, and so it became, in a way, you were as visible as you were on the page. Physically, you were invisible, which made it respectable in a way, because no one knew what you looked like. And so I resented that a lot, because my father, my parents and my culture never had an issue with me being a writer, because no one was going to know what I looked like, and no one was going to really, and then lo and behold, I happened to belong to a moment in time where the internet came along and I was asked for author pictures and stuff. So suddenly my words and everything, you can see what I look like now. So that invisibility is gone. And now the stuff I write about, I think, had I, like I say in my TEDx talk, I realized that I think the reason I stuck with writing and didn't venture out into acting eventually was because I think so much of my autonomy was taken away from me. And when you're a writer, you are the creator, you create. Whereas when you're an actor, you tell someone else's story. You recreate someone else's story visually, but when you're the writer, you write that story. And I wanted to be in
control.
I wanted, sure. Love that word. Yes, I wanted to be in control of the destinies of my characters in the way that I wasn't allowed to be in control of my own destiny. And it's taken a lot of self introspection and everything to come to these epiphanies. It's not like, I was like, oh yeah, this is the reason. And I think that's what writers do also. We spend so much time. I think we like ourselves enough to spend a lot of times with ourselves and our minds and our hearts, figuring out why and what and whatever. And if those of us who come from somewhat backgrounds of trauma or some backgrounds of whatever, we really, really do dig deep into why we're writing the stuff we do, why we're thinking the stuff we do. And so these epiphanies, I mean, this particular one came about because of the TEDx talk, where I was like, hey, wait a second, I came out to the US. Why didn't I do any? And I realized, no, I somehow, writing did choose me. But then I guess I chose it too, because I stuck to it. I just had that thought. Yeah. So thank you, reading again books. But you know, and I very recently actually I did I was invited to give a keynote at a citizenship oath ceremony in Georgia, in actually the very place that I became a naturalized citizen myself. So it was funny for a circle, and I gave a keynote about that at the Red Clay Writers Conference, which then ended up. The Georgia Review asked for it as an essay, so it's in there to read too. But I had another very important epiphany, which is the movie that made me tell my mother at age 12 that I wanted to become an actress is called Umrao Jaan, and it's about two girls who are kidnapped in India, set in many centuries ago, India. One is light complexioned, one is dark complexioned. The light complexioned one goes on to become a wife if someone marries her, and the dark complexioned one is sold into prostitution. And I was really riveted with the story, and it is the story about the woman who goes on to become a prostitute. And actually, it is based on this book by it's called Umrao Jaan, based on the story by Mirza Hadi Ruswa. This is a translation, and I read it in translation. But then India and Pakistan both made movies on this. And the first time I saw that, I was riveted by the story. I was taken by her life. It's actually supposedly based on the on the story of a real this happened to a real woman. But then when I was doing my keynote speech for the conference, it suddenly occurred to me that the reason it was this movie and not some other song and dance or love story movie, whatever, was because I think that 12, 13-year-old me looked at this movie and realized, oh, so this is, I think social justice and human rights became very important to me. And this particular movie struck me for that. But it seemed to me that being an actor was the medium with which to be able to tell these stories. And then because, like I said, we do so much introspection. I mean, when you're writing speeches and you're writing novels and essays and stuff, you have to. It's So then I realized very recently that the reason I perhaps one of the reasons that was the movie that turned.
I getcha.
Yeah. Okay. So I think I stayed a writer, not because I wanted to be an actor and the fame and the stardom and stuff, but because for me, writing is a way to connect with these themes, socially relevant themes. But that movie and that actress was the kind of
voice as a writer that you do as an actor.
Yes, but it took me almost, a good many decades to realize, to have this particular epiphany. So yeah, and I'm very grateful that I do have these epiphanies, because they help me come to terms with that lack of autonomy way back then. And
you're a teacher, right?
I do teach. I recently taught at Emory. I've taught at Oglethorpe. I teach creative writing and literature. I teach at Reinhardt University. They're low res programs. So I do private class. I've taught private classes also. I used to do, I used to help out a lot of writers with manuscript consultations and stuff. I don't have that much time now, but I do still try to help. So, but I've just been invited I did a whole series with the public libraries in Georgia. I've just been invited by the Sharon Forks Library to teach another class. So yeah, I like teaching. I try to stay connected with it as much as I can. But I have to say, I did choose to devote a lot of my time to being a novelist also. That is how I see myself, novelist, and then as a personal essayist. So those are the two things where I do like to put a lot of my focus.
And what are you working on now?
I'm working on too many. I'm always working on something and nothing, honestly. Like I said, I'm scheduled to give the keynote address for the Jane Austen Festival. So I'm working on that. Looking at my Austen stuff, looking at all of that, and yeah.
This past year, my daughter, I don't think she quite has the patience to read Pride and Prejudice, but I had her sit down and watch the BBC version, which is how I got introduced to it in the 90s when it came out. And yes. I had so much fun watching her watch it. Like, she's like, oh, Wickham is so nice. Oh my gosh, Wickham.
Well, he is nice to begin with, right? If you're not familiar with the plot and what happens, he is very nice. I mean, Elizabeth Bennet is taken in. Let's not forget that Elizabeth does harbor some feelings for Wickham in the beginning, but then he decides to marry, someone else for money, and she's okay with his marrying for money, but not Charlotte doing well by herself. It's a very interesting book in that way. Many people don't realize also in the novel, at least, that when Mrs. Bennet sends Jane in the rain on horseback to Netherfield Park, Mrs. Bennet is hoping they're going to ask her to spend the night, and that, Miss Bingley will fall in love or whatever. And Elizabeth says, and this is the great thing about Austen, she doesn't tell us the tone in which it's said. However, Elizabeth does say something akin to, that's a great idea. And it isn't until it starts to rain that Elizabeth's like, oh my God, she could get ill, and even a cold could kill you back then. But Elizabeth and her mother are a little in sync sometimes in the novel, and it's a very interesting, the thing is with the beauty about the 1995 Elizabeth Ellie Colin Firth version is that I think it's 5-6 hours. It's a mini series, so they're really able to unpack the book and the nuances
in there.
And I recently, and whereas the 2005 Keira Knightley movie, it's 2 hours, and so how much can you show in 2 hours, right?
They do a good job for 2 hours, but it's not
they do a great job.
Yeah.
But the thing is, they have to show the major plot points. They don't have time for a lot of so for instance, where Colin's character can come off as a little buffoonish in a 2-hour period, in that 5-hour period, you really get a feel. He's still a fool. He's still a buffoon. I don't think anyone can play.
He's one of my favorite characters.
Oh my God! But no one. I'm waiting to. I don't know who can top Colin Firth. Sorry, not Colin Firth, but David Bamborough as Mr. Collins in the 1995 version. I mean, just that creepy wave. And just everything. I love that. That's my favorite. I like the Keira Knightley version too. It's 2 hours. It goes by. I love all of them. But that 1995 is just.
Did you see was it the one with where the King of England has to be taught how to not stutter, which I'm totally stuttering.
The King's Speech.
King's Speech. And they had that 5-minute Pride and Prejudice reunion. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Colin Firth was in it, the guy who played Mr. Collins, and then Elizabeth Bennet's in it, and they're all in the room at the same time, and I was like, ah!
Yeah, I just recently, these days, my husband and I have been binging on Agatha Christie's Miss Marple, Hercule Poirot, another detective series. And we watched one where the person, I forget her name, the one who plays Jane Bennet, and David Bamborough, Mr. Collins, is in that murder mystery together. And and when they showed up on screen and then together, I was like, oh my God, it's like going home in a way, right?
Yeah. I got my husband to watch it once because I'm like, yeah, he's never going to read the book. And he stayed up till 3 a.m. He binged the entire series. Yeah. And then when my daughter's turn, he did the same thing.
Yeah, no, my husband did that with the 1995, and then recently my best friend's daughter, who had not read Austen or Jane, Pride and Prejudice stuff, I said, you know what, just watch this, do it for me, do it as a favor, and she did, and she loved it. And then she read Unmarriageable and loved it so much. I given my best friend a T-shirt saying, with the cover, and she wore that and put it up on her Instagram, and then she read Pride and Prejudice. So which was, it was, and she's younger. And I think for a lot of younger, and this is the wonderful thing about any movies that are made, any stage production, anything, is that it introduces, even little, there's one book, the Goodnight Moon, there's a Goodnight Mr. Darcy. So, there is, I have it, I don't know where it is. I bought it from Jane Austen books at the Jane Austen summer program, where I was one of the keynotes last year. So, it's a Goodnight Mr. Darcy and all of that. So my point was, though, that whether it's zombies, whether it's whatever, whether it's the 2005, it really does introduce a whole group of new viewership to Jane Austen and her works. And the hope is that then when they watch the movies, when they're introduced to these things, they will then pick up Jane Austen herself, because Pride and Prejudice is wonderful, but I will say Mansfield Park is my favorite novel.
That was one of my questions. Yeah,
it's her Grimmest. It's about three sisters. The very first opening pages of Mansfield Park, I think, are one of the best opening pages I've read. It's about how three sisters get married into different socioeconomic classes, and how that then really determines not just their lives, but the lives of their children. And my very opening to Unmarriageable actually is a nod to Mansfield Park's opening. So I'm going to read that real quick. So what Austen says in her first 2-3 pages, my nod is, it is a truth universally acknowledged that a girl can go from pauper to princess, or princess to pauper, in the mere seconds it takes for her to accept a proposal. And I remember reading that with Mansfield Park, and that really, in Pakistan at that time, and even in any society, maybe sometimes that is the truth. Sometimes it's true for a guy also. The person he marries can determine the trajectory of his life in many respects. But Northanger Abbey is another favorite of mine. It's one of the least read Austen novels, I feel, because people get a little intimidated because it's billed as a Gothic parody, and people feel that they need to know what Gothic means in literary terms and whatever. And I have to say, I found a connection with Unmarriageable with that, because I feel that sometimes people might be scared to pick up Unmarriageable because they feel they need to have read Austen or Pride and Prejudice and then come to that. No, standalone. But same way with Northanger Abbey, it's a standalone Austen novel. You don't have to know anything about Gothic literature, Gothic books, what Gothic even means.
It's very tongue-in-cheek. She's just such a great satirist.
It's a wonderful novel. It's her young adult novel, the satire, the friendship. I think it so wonderfully explores friendships also. The Isabella Thorpe is an early precursor and a much meaner one of Mary Crawford in so many ways, and Lucy in Sense and Sensibility. And please, everyone whoever wants to read Austen, read Northanger Abbey if you haven't, because
have it in stock.
It's yes. Please get it from Read It Again Books, who are doing curbside pickups right now, and please do. It's you'll people look for Austen. They read the Austens and they're like, what can we read next? And then you discover they haven't read Northanger Abbey, and I'm like, read Northanger Abbey. So yeah, Mansfield Park. I ran on a few years ago. I did a year book club for the Jane Austen's death anniversary year, and I did a special book club at my local library, North Spoil Oaks, and so I had to decide which sequence to read the books, how to discuss them and stuff. It was really wonderful. I love doing that, and I have an essay online about that too, about if anyone's interested.
So,
that.
I do have a question. So yeah. I'm going to totally jump in. So essays. Do you have a collection of all your essays? Are you going to make one of those?
In the same realm that I'm asked when I'm putting the cookbook out, and I always smile and, well, with the cookbook, no, not happening. But with an essay collection, I actually have enough essays at this point, and I'd love to. But thank you, Kim, for the encouragement. Something to.
I love a good collection of essays. I do, and
did you hear that, publishers out there? Kim,
yeah, I will follow it if she writes it. People, I will do it.
If I write it, I already have so many essays out there, and even to compile them, and they're all thematically, they're connected. They go back and forth, so I have enough to do that. And then, of course, do some rewriting and stuff. But definitely, I have all of that. But it's a question, once again, with any writer in any book, is sitting down and doing the grunt work, which is actually doing the writing. But no, I do have. I will say, I'm always asked. I am asked. Are you essay and stuff, and it just comes down to the two most difficult things, I think, sometimes, which is number one, sitting down and doing that work, and number two, publisher. So I think for a lot of writers, but especially I think sometimes for writers of color, being published is very challenging. It's because publishing, as we know, it is a business at the end of the day. It's not a charity organization. Publishers are looking to see what will sell at their end, and sometimes then they're looking at, of course, marketing seems to be making a lot of decisions now, and sometimes a lot of books which should be published or voices which should be out there don't necessarily get there because marketing can't match readership to them, which is a pity, because I know for the American readers here who have read my, An Isolated Incident, they love it. But it's not published here, so it's not like I can say, well, go to Read Again Books and pick it up. But what can you do? Sometimes convincing publishers to put something out there is a challenge for. I mean, I remember with African American literature in the early 80s, not 80s, 90s. Mm-hmm. Publishers were not willing to publish them. And then there were writers, even like Terry McMillan and stuff, who went from church to church with their books in the trunk of their cars, selling them. And it wasn't until the publishers saw that they were actually selling books, there's a market for African American literature, that suddenly, you know, imprints, and they started publishing and whatnot. And you know, the thing is, I don't want to have authors from any culture or any voice, from any, you know, writer of colors, have to put any books in their trunk and go from place to place to place. I would love for publishers to be open to more diverse, multicultural stories, be it novels, be it essays, be it memoirs and stuff. And, you know, there's definitely, I think, an audience for all these voices and all these stories.
I think so. And I think
you tell me, Kim, you run a bookstore.
Yeah, I sell them. And I think essays right now are popular. There's a lot of people, especially humorists, coming out with a collection of essays. And I think right now is the perfect time to read essays because it doesn't take much brain power. You can commit to like an hour and your essay is done. And it's perfect for right now.
Even less than an hour. You know, a lot of places give you a time for how long the essay will take, so they'll have 4 minutes, 10 minutes and stuff. You know, I have and the thing is, you know, I have 2 essays in the New York Times, which one was about a horrible miscarriage I had, and then there's a companion essay to it called Plating Memory, and it's about food actually, and it's about how food became a healing medium after the miscarriage, but also how community strangers reached out to me. How a stranger, it's about basically of my daughter's best friend in kindergarten, her mother, who I didn't know, but her daughter said that, oh, my friend's mother's going through this. She turned up on my doorstep with enchiladas, and I'd never eaten enchiladas, and I wasn't that fond of Mexican food, or it wasn't a taste I developed yet. But I tell you, I kept those enchiladas in the fridge for so long because it wasn't just that it was the time and the effort and her coming and her thinking and everything. And this was someone I didn't know. And the essay in that's called Plating Memory. And it's about how the food we eat, the food we make, it's so often, even subconsciously, we might not realize it. It's so often not just something.
It's not just food. It's
not just food. It's memory. It's nostalgia. It's your relative. It's your friends. It's healing. It's peace. It's anger sometimes, you know. So that essay is about all of that.
All anger eat a pint of ice cream.
You know, the thing with ice cream is that it is a universal food. You eat it for friendship, for anger, for boredom, for comfort, for just everything. Ice cream is there for me. You know, I don't know if I'm so much of an ice cream person, but I love pasta. Oh my God, I love pasta so much. And I have carb issues. I'm insulin resistant, so I can't eat carbs. I'm
celiac. I can't.
I can't touch grains, but I do every so now and then, which is I allow myself that. But yeah, so food is just so it's but just that act of someone I didn't know bringing me something. And it's part of Pakistani culture also, which is so touched me. You know, when there's a death, you take food over to eat. When there's any you know, food is healing, food is love, food is family, food is in Pakistani culture itself. So for me at that moment, I was newly moved to Georgia. I didn't know anyone. I didn't have any friends. We were, you know, and this traumatic thing had happened so soon after being
uprooted
to a new place. Yeah. And it was just, it meant so much to me. And yeah, but it's an upbeat essay. I have a lot of upbeat essay, and there's you know, so what I'm reading these days actually is
that was my next question.
Yes, so there's this Georgia Review issue that just came out, Consensus, and it's about identity and immigration and the census, the 2020 census. Wonderful issue packed with stuff, as well as that keynote address I gave about, and it's called Writing the Immigrant Southern in the New South. And it's about how not just how you begin to call a place or think of a place as home, but how a place, a geography, begins to call you an author of their own. I mean, as you know, with Unmarriageable, it's up for 2 Georgia Literary Awards, the Townsend Prize, and it's also nominated as a Georgia Author of the Year in Literary Fiction. And then in 2019, Georgia Center for the Book named it one of their 10 book all Georgians should read. And, you know, I've had, you know, there's so many Southern and Georgia places which have taken a book like Unmarriageable, which is completely set in Pakistan, and then they call me a Georgia author and stuff. And it's just for someone whose thematic material is home, belonging, identity, geographical location, dislocation and relocation, and what all these things mean. It's just a remarkable journey in that way. And then there's these two, which are I've got essays in both of these, and they're diametrically interesting and opposite. So one is this anthology called Choice Words, edited by Annie Finch, and it's writers on abortion. And it's a wonderful compendium of writers from Alice Walker onwards, and essays from contemporary writers also. But then I have another one called What God Is On It Here, writings on miscarriage and infant loss by and for Native women and women of color. So it's been very interesting to be in 2 anthologies, one miscarriage and one abortions, which sort of have so much connection between the 2 in terms of loss and grief, or maybe no loss and grief, because there's so many different ways in which this particular thing might happen to women, and then something that's really not talked about. And then this little thing came out by Hub City Press.
I love Hub City.
Yes. A Measure of Belonging, and 21 Writers of Color on the New American South, edited by Sanal Barnes. And really, I'm mentioning all of these because they're of the South. They're either set in Georgia, not set in Georgia, but they bring different identities, people from different walks of life together, and share the universal experiences between that we all have, which is very, very important to me in so many respects. So yeah.
So another book that I would like to recommend is Unmarriageable. And I love your mug, by the way.
Yes.
So again, we have Unmarriageable in stock, and Soniah said she'd come sign them. So please come do that. And I think if anybody was going to publish a collection of your essays, it would be Hub City. Hub City, if you're watching, we need a collection of essays by Soniah, please.
I would love that. I love Hub City. One of my favorite memories is that South Carolina has this writers thing called Delicious Reads. And when Unmarriageable came out, I was one of the authors they'd invited. And Hub City Press has a bookstore. Their bookstore is right there. And I was walking by, and all of a sudden I saw Unmarriageable in the window. And I have a picture on my Instagram account. I'm squatting, showcasing it, because I did not expect that. That little moment was ice cream moment for me, and I love it. But Hub City Press is great, and if you're listening, and yes, I would love that so much. But read it again. Kim said that. So anyway, we'll see when it's when I put. We'll see, and we'll see where it ends up and stuff. So yeah.
So anyway, buy Unmarriageable, and hopefully when your other book comes out, yes, there we go, buy Unmarriageable, and we have it here. I support your local independent bookstore. If I'm not your local independent bookstore, find one and buy books from them, because they're very important. Soniah wrote on our wall, "Books over looks," right?
Yes. It's another tagline in Unmarriageable, because another important theme in there is Mrs. Binat is all about looks, and she thinks looks are the most important thing and get you where you want in life and get you everything. And Alys says, no, books over looks. Your smarts, your intellect, your kindness should be more important. So the mother-daughter struggle with that. But one of the taglines in the novel and for Unmarriageable is books over looks, because I believe that myself. So yeah.
Well,
I love that on your wall, your wonderful author
you did.
wall.
You got a great author wall.
I love, and then
you're on there.
Said on your Instagram page, I think you said this is still the most interesting. I was like, yes. So let's see who's able to write something fascinating also and intriguing like that.
Nikki and Jessica put a heart around theirs and it says forever.
Yes.
Or maybe they didn't put a heart, they just put forever because they're married.
Yeah, people, you need to go to Read It Again books to buy all their books, but once everything opens, or go to their Instagram page and see all the pictures of that wall. It's a writer's wall. And it's great.
And yeah. Awesome. Well, Soniah, this has been amazing. I love this. I love talking to you because you're so passionate. I love it.
Thank you. And as you know, we were originally supposed to do this. I was supposed to come in store. And this year with my paperback release, I have a whole PowerPoint presentation I do, which with pictures shared from my childhood and the books that come in Unmarriageable. And then I have to say there's one that I love showing, which is of 2 peacocks. And there's one peacock in Georgia and one peacock in Lahore, Pakistan. And no one to date has ever gotten right which peacock is set where. And because there's a background with that peacock. So I love I start out with that little thing. But hopefully when all this is over, I would love to come back. And
I would love to have you.
And you and that essay of mine that the Judy Blume, the art writers as your mothers and stuff, which you'd asked me to read out for this thing. I love that you love that. And
that made me cry the first
I want to come back.
There was not a dry eye in the place when you read that. I mean, this was for Women Alone Together, and which is a
wonderful organization for women who are widowed or are finding themselves in a changed status in life, and they want to be they want to find support, community, friendship, and stuff. Lovely organization. But yeah, I read this, but I did my presentation, which didn't have PowerPoint then. And so I added the PowerPoint later, but that's where you heard the essay. And thank you. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Anyway, thank you for joining us, everybody. And if you need Soniah's books, we have them. And thanks again.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Read It Again Books and all independent booksellers. And, please go to Read Again Book, and anyone wants a signed copy, I will drive there and curbside. I will sign your copy for you, and you will have a signed copy. Thank you again, Kim, for doing this, and for all the authors you're interviewing and stuff. We love this. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Bye.